Hi, my name's Kevin Hicks. Welcome to my YouTube channel, The History Squad. Now, today's film has been voted in by my Patreon members. Thanks a bunch, guys. This is about the victims of Jack the Ripper, the infamous murders of autumn 1888. East End of London, Whitechapel to be precise. And what this film is about the victims themselves. There is so much involved when it comes to the police matters and on all of the investigations around it. I'm not so much interested in that. It's the victims themselves. The reason being, it's the poverty that was in the East End and parts of the centre of London at the time. I have a family connection to it. But before we go into it, bit of a disclaimer. It's about murders, isn't it? Broadly accepted by historians, there were 5 Ripper murders. There may have been more. I'm not going there. But when I describe the lives and deaths of these victims, bless them, it's a bit gory. So if you've got any children watching, either move them or warn them. So, poverty, East End of London. On the 1881 census, there was 1 million people living in the East End of London. Now, if you take the poverty side, that's 1/3 of the people who live there. So that's 1/3 of 1 million were living in poverty. And in 1888, in Whitechapel, just in half a square mile, 75,000 people crammed together. There were over 200 lodging houses housing 8,000 people in Whitechapel. Remember, it's a small area, this tiny little part. But these lodging houses, I read how they had one room, had 600 beds. Now, these beds could vary. They could be single, they could be double. If it's a single, 4pence a night, right? 4 pennies. If it was a double, 8 pennies. There were others where they didn't have beds as we would know them. They're basically coffins. And you didn't go in between them. They were shoulder to shoulder. This is absolute poverty. This is people who have not had a home, some of them ever. And they literally live from hand to mouth. So you got one family in Whitechapel at this time who were interviewed, questioned about what was their life like. They had visited a shop, now get your head around this, 75 times in a week. And I'm thinking, have I got that right? So a family goes to the shop 75 times. Because people were so malnourished, they couldn't work a full day. You've got guys who worked on the docks in London. They would go to work with nothing in their belly. And these are men who are going to have to really work as a stevedore, hauling all of that gear. So they would work for an hour or two, draw money so they could have something to eat. They couldn't work beyond 4 o'clock. They were exhausted. So the families, they would have money by the hour, I suppose. So the 75 visits to the shop was for a pinch of tea, a pinch of sugar, so they could have a cup of tea. Half a loaf of bread. When they got the money, they could eat. Now, on top of all of this, there was a massive influx of immigrants coming in, mainly from Russia, Russian Jews, who were escaping the pogroms. And of course, where are they going to live? They're going to live in the poor areas. And this created an awful lot of tension at the time. Now, this Whitechapel area, there were parts of it, of course, where people lived fairly peaceable lives. But where the murders took place, this tight area where all of these lodging houses are, it was a warren of alleyways. They call it the rookeries. And it was dangerous. There were murders, there was violence, there was drunkenness. The streets were a dangerous place. But I've missed a little bit on the lodging houses. Oh, you could spend 4pence on a bed, or you could have a tuppenny hang, where you simply sat on a bench, hung your arms over the rope, and you fell asleep. Even worse than that, a penny sit-up. You weren't allowed to sleep, but you could sit on a bench, not allowed to sleep. And then, of course, if you couldn't afford any of that, or you couldn't get to the workhouse, then the streets is where you will sleep. This goes to show you how these people were living day to day, not over a short period. This was their lives. So, our first victim, Mary Ann Nichols, her nickname was Polly, 31st of August 1888, Bucks Row, Whitechapel. There were two men going to work. It was 3:45 a.m. when they found her. Well, the one found her, then he called over to the other guy, come and have a look at this. He thought he'd found a whole pile of tarpaulin or something that would be useful. But what he found, of course, was the body of a woman. The area was so dilapidated. Lighting was very poor. And so these two men, they're looking at a woman in the semi-darkness. They can see that her skirts have been brought up. They can see blood around her throat. They're not sure if she's dead, if she's been raped. They talk about going to move the body. They decide not to. They're going to go off and find a police officer. As they leave the scene, it's just in the entranceway to a gateway there. They pull the skirts down for her modesty and go off to work, hoping to find a policeman on the way. They don't. A policeman, however, finds the body. And there he is with his bullseye police lamp looking down at this woman who's had her throat slit by the looks of it. Now, these police lamps aren't very good. I used to have one. They're basically a naked flame with a magnifying lens. He signals to another policeman. They come over. But of course, the skirts have been pulled down. So you can't see what's happened elsewhere on the body. They immediately call Dr. Llewellyn, who has a surgery nearby. He comes over. He can see that she is dead and her throat has been slit. So, normal procedure. It's nothing like modern policing. The body is removed by ambulance. Don't be misled by ambulance. It's a stretcher on two bicycle wheels with a hood over it. And the body is taken. They don't have an official local mortuary. This is this run-down area, isn't it? Whitechapel. So the body is lodged in the yard of the local workhouse. The next morning, it will be stripped by two pauper inmates. Think about that, eh? Two pauper inmates. These poor men, one of whom I believe suffered from fits. The body is taken into the mortuary, put on the slab, and a policeman then supervises as they begin to cut away or remove the clothing and throw it into the corner. As they cut open part of the bodice, they then realise that there is damage there. So they stop. Dr. Llewellyn is summoned again. He comes and takes over. And what he finds is that this poor unfortunate woman has actually had her throat slit twice, from left to right. One of them has gone so deep it's almost severed the head. The body itself, from the pelvis right the way up to the stomach, has been sliced wide open and the vagina has been stabbed. It's been so deep, the cut, that actually the intestines are bulging out. He reckons it was a knife that a shoe leather worker could use, something very similar to this, razor sharp. So it's a craftsman's knife, really. But they don't know who she is. And this is the sad thing, isn't it? Unless you read the books, unless you look into it, these are just victims. But Mary Ann Nichols was quite a girl, really. She was identified because of a piece of paper that said that she'd been into the workhouse. And so they backtracked, and somebody from the workhouse came down and identified that, yeah, it was Mary Ann Nichols. Polly, bless her. She's in her 40s. I've read different accounts of how old she was. 42, 47. She was in her 40s. She was born a Londoner. Her dad was a blacksmith. She was married. Her husband was a printer at Fleet Street. She was married, get your head around this, at the age of 12. They had 6 children together. And it was after the 6th child was born that the marriage began to fall apart because of the evil gin, alcoholism. She leaves the marital home and she drifts, but she has an allowance of 5 shillings a week paid for by her husband. He stops the allowance when he finds out that Polly is making a living as a prostitute. He is summoned. Hi, why have you stopped paying, and when he explains that she's making a living, well, that's it. But the things that led to her death are heartbreaking, really. She was in a bit of a state. She'd lost some of her teeth. She'd been to the pub on the night before she was murdered, and she was drunk. She'd gone back to Wilmot's common lodging house, but she didn't have fourpence, 4 pennies, less than the price of a loaf of bread for her lodgings. She was sat in the kitchen when the superintendent, I suppose you call him, came over and says, "Have you got your lodging money?" "No," says Polly, and she's thrown out. And she says, "Oh, don't worry, I'll soon get the money. I've got my jolly bonnet." Or worse to those effects, she got this nice hat. And off she went. And she met her fate. She was a real person. And all for the price of 4 pennies. Well, it cost her her life. So the next victim, bless her, Annie Chapman, another lady in her 40s. Her body was found 6 a.m. on the 8th of September 1888 in the yard behind 29 Hanbury Street, Whitechapel. These dilapidated houses were crammed full of people. There were 17 people living in 29 Hanbury Street. Some of them had little businesses in the room. And her body was found in between the steps and the fence separating their yard from the next. It was obvious that she was dead, throat slit, and there were other things that had been done to the body. There was blood. A workman took a swig of brandy and then threw over a bit of tarpaulin over the body to conceal it. Crowds were gathering fast before the police could get there. When the police arrived, the doctor was called, Dr. Bagster Phillips, and he was like the modern equivalent of a scenes of crime officer, and he ascertains that the intestines have been actually removed and placed on her shoulder. Now the body was removed very quickly, and ironically, before it was placed on the ambulance, it was placed in the same coffin shell as our previous victim, Polly. Taken to the mortuary, and Dr. Bagster Phillips, he's getting angry about the conditions he has to work in, because 2 nurses had stripped the body down, blood had been washed away, clothes had been thrown into a corner. But what he found was how she'd been murdered. It looks like she'd been pounced on, possibly from the front. Her tongue was out, a bruising round the neck, so she'd been strangled, lowered to the ground, and she'd been slashed so deep that the head had almost been cut off from the body. But then when he lifts up the rest of the body to have a look, I've got it written down in some notes here, because it's quite something. Strangled, throat slit twice, intestines cut out and placed on the shoulder, her uterus and appendages, upper part of vagina and posterior, 2/3 of the bladder had been entirely removed. And he reckoned they'd been removed with one slice of a knife. So he said in his report, obviously done by an expert. And it took time. So she'd been seen earlier on, about an hour before the body was found. So Annie Chapman, let's find out a little bit about her, shall we? Annie Chapman, the real person, yeah, not just a victim. She was a Windsor girl, grew up not far from Windsor Castle. She married John Chapman. He was a coachman. So there is a photograph actually of them on their wedding day. She seemed to have been doing all right. They had 2 children, a daughter and a son, and unfortunately the son was crippled. He couldn't walk. And then the demon drink gets involved, and she used to be seen walking around the estate staggeringly drunk. So they parted. Very, very sad. But the husband used to send her 10 shillings a week allowance. Now, 18 months before her death, this stopped. and she found out that her husband had in fact died, and her children, her boy was put into a cripple school, and her daughter was sent away to a school in France, and we know nothing about that. But her movements after that are quite interesting, because she did have another partner. Just common law, they used to lodge together. She took on a nickname Civvy, or Civ, because he used to make iron sieves. But she went down and down, and it's sad because she was a clever girl. She could crochet, she was good at selling flowers and matchboxes and things like this, but she would prostitute herself and not care. And of course, the alcohol is taking a big toll on her life. She's becoming malnourished, she's ill. She actually had a fight in her lodgings over some soap. She'd borrowed some soap and not give it back, and Annie got a kicking, as we would say. She got a black eye and her chest was really badly bruised. She was seen by a friend leaning against a wall, oh, I'm so ill, she was saying, and then her friend gave her tuppence for a cup of tea. So people did care. But then we go back to the fourpence. Later on, she was in the lodgings, and it was obvious she couldn't pay the fourpence for her night's lodgings, so she had to leave. A night watchman says he saw her, but the park keeper's wife at 5:30 in the morning saw her at the entrance to the yard to Hanbury Street with a man, and she heard them agreeing to do the business, apparently. So that was the last time she was seen alive. A real person who'd fallen on hard times. It was the gin. It's one of the reasons I made the film, The History of Gin. Our next victim, the third victim, what some people refer to as the double event. Elizabeth Stride, 30th of September 1888, was found in Dutfield Yard, which is just off Berners Street. The way the body was found, it's just after midnight, and there's a chap returning from selling jewellery or something. He's got his little pony cart, and as he's going to turn left into the yard, his horse shies away. So he gets down and he thinks there's somebody sleeping rough, and what he finds, of course, is a body. Her throat had been slit, and in no time at all, there is the hue and cry, and the crowd are gathering. The police turn up, the body is removed, and it's found that her stomach, her abdomen, has not been torn open. She has had her throat slit, similar to the others. Some people do put a question mark, was this part of the Ripper murders? And it's interesting because she was seen in that location with a man having a bit of a row by a chap who was walking past. Israel Schwartz was his name. But he didn't want to get involved. What he saw, he thought it was a domestic argument. Now, what the evidence from the body reveals is that she was grabbed so fiercely from behind, because there was bruising in the neck and shoulders, that she was forced down to the ground, possibly strangled, turned over, and then her throat is slit. The murderer must have been disturbed, because he's had it on his toes. And you'll see with the next victim what happens next in this series of events. But let's go back to the victim herself. Let's find out about Mrs. Stride. We don't know that much about Elizabeth Stride, but we do know that she wasn't English. Her maiden name was Gustafsdotter. She was from Gothenburg in Sweden, where she was known to be a prostitute, or registered as a prostitute. She'd had treatment, I think, twice for venereal disease. When she came over to England, when she emigrated to England, it was a bit of a step up, because she married John Stride. He was a carpenter in Sheerness. Apparently they set up a coffee shop and tried to run it. Now, I don't know for sure why that ended, either through separation, 1877, or death of John. She then migrates to the East End of London, to Whitechapel, where she shacks up with Michael Kidney. It's a come and go relationship. He understands that she likes to go off on a bender. She's a prostitute. So they do this business of drifting in, drifting out of their relationship. In the few years they were together, I think they were separated for 5 months. And it was always the same reason: drink. And that kind of almost ends the story, except for this one little kind of a twist, I suppose. Was Dr. Bernardo, the famous Dr. Bernardo of the Dr. Bernardo homes, actually visited a doss house where she was known to frequent 4 days before the murder. And he met a group of the girls in the kitchen. And he talks to them about the murders around Whitechapel. And the remark from one of the girls is, "Oh, he won't be able to kill me." It was bravado. And then 4 days later, he is actually one of those who identifies Elizabeth Stride. So at the time of the discovery of Elizabeth Stride's body in Dutfield's yard, Catherine Eddowes, Kate, was being released from Bishopsgate's police station where she'd been held on drunken charges. Now, this Kate, Catherine, she was born in Wolverhampton, but her family moved down to London when she was at a very young age. She had a common law husband, Thomas Conway. They had 3 children. Now, we're not sure why the marriage broke up. Either he was violent or it was because of her drunken behaviour. She did have another relationship, which continued to the time of her death, John Kelly. Now, the pair of them, they were quite a pair from the little bits that you can glean. They went hop picking before her death, down into Kent in the summertime. Every year, people from the East End of London go down to Kent, the Garden of England, picking the hops. It was a bit of a holiday, out in the sunshine, away from the smoke of London. But unfortunately for Kate and John, it had been a bad harvest. They made no money. So they had to walk back to London, quite some distance. When they get back to London, luck is still against them. They've got no money. So for food, they pawn his boots and a spare shirt. Now, pawn, just in case you're not familiar with it, pawnbroking, you go in, you pledge something for cash and you say you'll pick it up in 2 weeks' time. If you don't, it costs you a little bit more, then it'll be sold on. There was always 3 balls, 1, 2, 3, above the sign of pawnbrokers. And in Birmingham, where I come from, when I was a kid, it was 2 to 1. You'll never get it back. So they pawn the boots and the shirt. They have enough money for food. And they spend the night in what's called a casual ward. This is a room on the side of a workhouse where vagrants, people for one night who've got nowhere to sleep, can just spend the night. This was incredibly hard times. Now, the next day, John Kelly actually makes some money and they're left with 6pence. So they have a choice, food or sleep, and they choose sleep. Now, John Kelly, he says to Kate, "You take the 4pence, you have the doss bed." And she says, no, you need the sleep. So he has the 4 pennies, yeah, for the doss. She has 2 pennies. She'll go to the casual ward. The next day, she's penniless. And she tells John that she's going to seek out her daughter, try and borrow some money. Well, somehow she found some money because she finds herself blind drunk. John, by the way, never sees her alive again. So on the evening of the 29th, about 8:30, a police constable Robinson finds Kate slumped against a wall in Aldgate Street. She's drunk, totally blotto. He tries to stand her up. She falls down. Now, I've done this as a police officer myself. Not the falling down, but trying to lift up a drunken lady. It's difficult. Anyway, he manages to do it. He arrests her for drunkenness, gets her to Bishopsgate police station, where they simply put them in the cells to sober up. Yeah, they don't hold them over for the magistrates to find them. It's a waste of time, a waste of money. 12:15 in the morning, she wakes up, and at 1 a.m. she is released. 45 minutes later, she's dead. The last time Catherine Eddowes was seen alive was at 1:30 in the morning, when a witness said she saw her outside Mitre Square with a man. This must have been the killer, because at 1:44 a.m, Police Constable Edward Watkins discovered the body in the far corner of Mitre Square, totally mutilated. Now, the square was very poorly lit and surrounded by very tall warehouses, but the killer only had around 10 minutes to perform the killing and then the mutilation. So the body was recovered from the scene, and as they undressed the body ready for the post-mortem, her ear, literally that had been severed, fell out of her clothing. The extent of her injuries here are quite awful. I'm going to read them out to you. Her throat had been cut to the spine, same as the other girls, yeah? She'd been sliced open from her rectum all the way through to the breastbone and disemboweled. Her insides had been taken out. Her abdomen was laid open. Bits of intestine had been laid around her body. Her face had been delicately cut, been disfigured. Her lower eyelids had been cut and her ear had fallen off. Her uterus and left kidney were extracted and removed from the scene. My goodness me, it makes you wonder, doesn't it, what happened to them? But poor Catherine, she was dead. All for want of fourpence for a bed. So from what I understand, they may have almost caught the murderer, because they'd found where he'd washed his hands. So they found blood-stained water. But it was during the post-mortem of Catherine that they found that a piece of her apron, which must have been totally blood-stained, had been torn off. This was found quickly in Galston Street by a police officer who, with his bullnose torch, he noticed there was some anti-Semitic writing, handwriting had been chalked on the wall, yeah, right next to the apron. And this is the murderer actually taunting the police. This means they have a sample of his handwriting. This is brilliant. Now, as a modern police officer, freeze the scene. Everything would be done. However, the Commissioner of the Metropolitan Police, Charles Warren, insisted that the anti-Semitic graffiti be washed away. Senior detectives took him to task about this. No, just leave it for now. We'll cover it up. We need it photographing. But he actually overrode them and destroyed what's got to be a crucial piece of evidence. It's interesting to note that the name Jack the Ripper had not yet been coined. It wasn't until a letter was received by the Central News Agency taunting the police and signed Jack the Ripper, which was then picked up by the press. Before then, it was simply the Whitechapel murders. So, Jack the Ripper's final victim, the last of the Whitechapel murders, Mary Jane Kelly, murdered on 9th of November 1888. Now, Mary Jane Kelly, she's a bit of an anomaly, really. First of all, she was the youngest of the Ripper's victims. She was 25 years of age, possibly the prettiest too. Mary was born in Limerick in Ireland. We know that much. The family moved over to South Wales. Now, this is where it all gets a little bit, is it true, is it not? She says she married a collier, a coal miner, had children. He was killed in an explosion. She moves to London. But she did this at the age of around about 18, from what I can gather. She says that she lived in various big houses. She was taken to France to live with a gentleman, but she didn't like it, so she came back. There's nothing to verify any of this. It may have just been a story. Who knows? But she lived with Joseph Barnett, common law, I suppose, in 13 Miller Court. Now, Miller Court, all of the rooms, from what I can tell, were rented by prostitutes. And that's where they conducted their business. Now, Joseph and Mary had one heck of a bull and a cow, a row. It was violent. A window was smashed, but the row was over Mary wanting to bring another prostitute into the room so that they could operate and make more money. Well, Joseph Barnett left. And it's a sad reflection here, because Mary was already 3 months in arrears with her rent, and she was drinking more and more heavily. Mary Kelly's last night on earth was spent mainly in the pubs at Commercial Street, but she was seen at 11:45 p.m. going into Miller's Court with a man. Mrs. Cox followed them in. She was a prostitute working from the same court. She describes the man as shabbily dressed, short, stocky build, wearing a billycock hat. Now, from what I understand, a billycock hat is some kind of bowler hat. Now, as the man slams the door, Mrs. Cox and Mary exchange good night, and Mary announces she's going to sing, and indeed she did, until 1 a.m. when Mrs. Cox comes back out of her room. She can hear Mary singing, but when Mrs. Cox returns to Miller Court at 3:10 in the morning, the lights are out at number 13 and all is quiet. But a strange thing here, the lady who lives above number 13 was woken by her cat between 3:30 and 4 o'clock in the morning. She heard someone cry out, "Oh help, murder," or words to that effect. But she thought nothing of it. There was always something going on in Miller Court, so she simply rolled over and went back to sleep. 10:45 a.m. in the morning, Thomas Bowyer, a shop assistant working for the owner of Miller Court, is sent round to number 13 to get some rent money out of Mary. He knocks on the door. There's no reply. Of course there isn't. He then goes round to the window. He can't quite see in, so he pushes the rag that's been stuffed into the hole of the broken pane there. What he sees horrifies him. He can see the body, of course, but on the table, lumps of flesh. He runs back to his boss, tells him what he's seen. The police are contacted. They turn up at the scene, but they do not enter. This is going to be held ready for the Commissioner of the Metropolitan Police to have a good look at. Superintendent Arnold is there. The crowds are gathering outside. People are shouting, newspaper boys, "Murder, murder," what's going on? But at 1:30 in the afternoon, the Commissioner still hasn't turned up. So Superintendent Arnold decides to effect an entry. When the police entered number 13 Miller Court, what they found must have been horrendous. And it's reported here in the Illustrated Police News. I'm going to read the report to you, so bear with me. It was reported that the throat had been cut right through with a knife, almost severing it from the body. The abdomen had been partially ripped open and both breasts cut from the body. Her left arm, like the head, hung by skin only. Her nose had been cut off. Her forehead skinned and thighs right down to the feet had been stripped of the flesh. Her liver and entrails had been wrenched away. Entrails and other portions of the frame were missing, but the liver was found placed between the feet of the poor victim. Flesh from the thighs and legs with breast and nose were placed by the murderer on a table, and one of her hands was pushed into her stomach. Do you know, the police actually had the crime scene this time photographed. I'm not going to show you this photograph because really it is quite horrendous and I don't want children to be looking at it. So there is a link in the description to what really was one of the first crime scene photographs ever taken. The inquest into Mary Kelly's death was held shortly afterwards, and it was ascertained the cause of death was her throat had been slit and she had been murdered. But the inquest was cut short. It was terminated all of a sudden. Witness statements hadn't been taken, and indeed one witness apparently hadn't been called at all, and he may have seen the murderer. Crucial evidence could have been lost because of this. But hey, Mary Kelly's murder, it was the last murder by Jack the Ripper, the Whitechapel murders. Jack the Ripper's reign of terror lasted only for a few short months in the autumn of 1888, but yet the mystery still continues to this very day. But despite all of the theories and the suspects who were interviewed, no one was ever brought to justice for the hideous crimes committed against these 5 poor women. Some of them wanted nothing more than fourpence for a bed. That's part of the thread that runs through this, isn't it? Poverty, alcohol, feeding a habit. We can draw parallels from that to this very day. So just before I finish, I'd like to go back a little bit. I did mention that there's a bit of a possible family connection. What it is this: part of my wife's family, going back well into the Victorian times, their surname is Kelly, and they all came from the same part of London as Mary Kelly, and indeed their heritage goes back to Ireland. And we wondered, did they know her? Did they meet her? But we shall never know. And this ripperology that I have been talking about, I didn't know it was called that until I had a look in a book here, The Complete Jack the Ripper, which was sent to me, signed to Kevin. Welcome to Ripperology. Yeah, Donald Rumbelow. Thanks, Donald. I met him on the battlefield at Waterloo many years ago. So I've read up on it, and I really do find the subject quite interesting, and I hope that you have found my video interesting. If you did, like, share and subscribe, and don't forget to turn on the all notification buttons so you know all the films that are coming your way from us. Now, a special mention, because I have some great Patreon members here: Blake Smith, Steve Valley, Jeffrey Hollowell. Guys, thanks a million.